welcome to Haunted Midnight. I upload true stories every week on my channel, so if you enjoy this video, check out my other videos. Before we begin, over 90% of you are not subscribed. It would be amazing if you guys can subscribe and support me, as I am still a small channel. Thank you for watching. I still remember the night I got that call like it was yesterday. I was sitting in my favorite diner, halfway through my third cup of coffee when at the job. It wasn't the usual long-haul run that I was used to. It was a special delivery with a load that came with no explanation, no company name, no markings, nothing. They just told me to pick it up from a location on the outskirts of town and deliver it to a site I'd never heard of. The whole thing smelled fishy from the get-go, but I've been trucking long enough to know that sometimes you just have to roll with it. I shrugged it off as one more mystery on the road, unaware of how deep this one would cut. The pickup was at a remote warehouse that seemed abandoned, with its rusted doors and flickering neon sign barely hanging on. The paperwork was sparse, just a plain slip with a location and a time. They handed over a sealed trailer with no markings or hints of what was inside. It was heavy and silent, as if it were holding something far more dangerous than just cargo. I climbed back into my rig, feeling an unusual mix of excitement and unease, and set out into the night with nothing but the hum of the engine and the open road for company. At first, the drive was uneventful, like any other long stretch of highway under a moonless sky. I kept my eyes on the road and my mind on the miles ahead. But soon I began noticing little things that didn't add up. There was a subtle noise coming from the back of the trailer, a kind of creaking and tapping that I initially blamed on the load shifting with every bump in the road. But even when the road was perfectly smooth, the sound persisted, almost like a faint whisper that was too deliberate to be random. I tried to ignore it and focus on my driving, but as the hours wore on, my nerves started to fray. The temperature inside my cab started dropping suddenly, even though it was a mild night outside. I remember glancing at the thermometer on the dash and being startled by the reading. It was nearly freezing in there. My hands began to feel numb as I gripped the wheel, and a chill crawled up my spine that wasn't entirely due to the cold air. I kept telling myself it was just a faulty sensor or a draft seeping in through a poorly sealed window. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with that trailer. Every time I passed a dark stretch of highway or an empty gas station, the eerie sensation grew stronger. The strangest part was the reflection in my side mirror. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a stray headlamp or a shadow playing a cruel joke on my tired eyes. But then it happened again, an unmistakable flash of movement behind me, a face that wasn't my own, gaunt and hollow, staring back for just a moment before vanishing into the darkness. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than my imagination running wild, fueled by exhaustion and isolation. I had been driving for hours without proper rest, and the solitude of the endless highway can make you see things that aren't there. Yet, every time the reflection appeared, it sent a jolt of dread through me. I couldn't tell if my mind was playing tricks or if there was a rational explanation behind these occurrences. I started to question everything. Maybe I was hauling a load of contraband, or perhaps I'd unwittingly become part of a smuggling operation. The lack of information only added to my anxiety. I remembered stories of drivers who had been involved in shady deals of cargo that was meant to be hidden from prying eyes. My gut told me that this load was different, that it carried a secret so dark that even the simplest explanation couldn't fully account for the strange noises, the sudden cold, and the haunting reflections. As I drove through one particularly desolate stretch of highway, the sounds from the trailer grew louder and more distinct. It was as if the cargo itself was trying to speak, to warn me about something I couldn't quite grasp. Every bump in the road seemed to trigger a new sound, a creak or a tap that resonated deep in my bones. The isolation of the night magnified each noise, turning the quiet hum of the engine into a sinister lullaby. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, trying to ignore the growing sense of foreboding that settled over me like a thick fog. I began to feel as if I wasn't alone in that truck. The persistent feeling of being watched made me jump at the slightest movement. I'd catch fleeting glimpses of something in the corner of my eye, a dark shape, a pair of eyes, a reflection that didn't match mine, and every time, I'd turn around to find nothing there. The combination of the mysterious cargo and the relentless isolation was starting to unravel my sense of normalcy. I kept thinking about the possibilities. Was I transporting something dangerous? Could it be a load of hazardous materials that required extreme secrecy? Or was it something else entirely? A remnant of a criminal enterprise or even a ghostly presence hitching a ride with me? At a point I pulled over at a deserted truck stop just to get a break and gather my thoughts. I stepped out of the cab and felt an unnatural chill that wasn't just the night air. I took a slow walk around my rig, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The truck stop was nearly empty, and the silence was almost oppressive. I could see my breath in the air, and the cold seemed to seep into every pore. In that moment, I couldn't shake the thought that I was involved in something beyond my control, something that I couldn't explain even if I tried. The load sat behind me, quiet and unyielding, as if it held a secret that was too dangerous to reveal. I got back into the cab and continued my drive, but my confidence was gone. Every mile felt like an eternity, and every shadow held the promise of something sinister. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, desperately trying to focus on the task at hand, but my mind was constantly drifting back to that mysterious load. I replayed every sound, every sudden drop in temperature, and every fleeting glimpse in the mirror over and over in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no easy answer. I was caught between two possibilities. Either my exhaustion was distorting my senses, or I was in the middle of something far more dangerous than a simple transportation job. When I finally pulled into my destination, a nondescript industrial area on the edge of a small town, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering dread. The delivery was handled by a couple of men who were as tight-lipped as the situation warranted. They took the trailer without a word, and I was left standing there in my truck, feeling more confused and unsettled than ever. I didn't ask questions because I knew better than to dig into things that weren't meant to be understood. I just drove away, hoping that leaving that mysterious load behind would allow me to forget the night's unsettling events. I still haul loads across the country, but nothing ever compares to that one trip. I don't know if the strange occurrences were a product of my overworked mind, or if there was something genuinely eerie about that shipment. I don't have all the answers, and I'm not really looking for them. I learned to trust my instincts and keep an extra eye on my mirrors, and I never take unmarked loads without a healthy dose of skepticism. That night left me with a sense of vulnerability, and a reminder that even in a world ruled by logic and routine, there are moments when the unknown creeps in and shakes you to your core. I don't dwell on it too much these days. I just keep on trucking, always a little more cautious and a little more aware that some loads are best left unexplained. I was hauling a load down a lonely stretch of interstate when I decided to pull over at a rest area I'd heard about more times than I can count. Folks on the road had mentioned it in passing, an isolated spot with a dark past, whispered about in truck stops as the scene of mysterious disappearances and violent incidents decades ago. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or legends, but when you're driving alone in the dead of night, even old rumors can prick at your nerves. I figured a short break wouldn't hurt, so I eased my rig into the nearly empty lot and stepped out, stretching my legs under a sky that was as pitch black as the secrets this place seemed to hold. The rest area wasn't much to look at. There were a few battered picnic tables, a rusted fuel pump station that hadn't seen real use in years, and a small building that appeared to house security monitors. I remembered truckers saying that this spot was once a hideout for some criminals, using the area's grim history to scare folks away from snooping around. As I walked towards the building to check out the security cameras, something I'd been meaning to do anyway, I couldn't shake the feeling that the whole place was watching me back. I settled on one of the worn benches near the building, trying to relax and just catch a breath. The night was silent, except for the occasional sound of wind whistling through broken glass and the distant hum of my own thoughts. That's when I first heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from behind the building. I told myself it was probably just a straight animal rustling through some debris, but the sound had a deliberate quality to it, like someone dragging something heavy along the concrete. I checked my watch. It was well past midnight, and every shadow seemed to carry its own secret. Feeling a mix of curiosity and unease, I wandered over to the building with the security monitors. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the glow of a few outdated screens. I switched on one of the cameras to get a better look at the lot. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show the empty expanse of the rest area. Then, in one of the feeds, I caught something that made my heart skip, a brief movement near the far corner of the lot. It wasn't a ghost or any supernatural being. It looked more like a person crouching near a dumpster, moving slowly as if trying not to be seen. The figure's shape was distorted by the poor lighting, and just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I rewound the footage several times, each playback confirming the same inexplicable motion. I couldn't help but wonder if someone was deliberately trying to stage a scene. I went back outside and sat near my rig, trying to piece together what I was experiencing. The rest area had an oppressive silence, and I began to hear more unsettling noises. There were intermittent creaks of metal and soft footsteps echoing in the empty lot. Every time I thought I identified the source, a gust of wind here, a settling structure there, the sounds returned with a stubborn persistence. I felt as though the whole area was playing tricks on me, and every unexplained sound intensified the feeling that I was not alone. As the minutes ticked by, I couldn't help but notice the flickering of the security lights on the lot. They would flash on and off at irregular intervals, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. At one point, I caught sight of a shadow crossing the field between the parking spaces in the building, a movement that didn't sync with the flickering lights at all. It was too deliberate to be a mere trick of the light. My mind raced with thoughts of the rest area's notorious history. Had someone taken the old stories and decided to use them as a cover for their own misdeeds? I started to question whether what I was witnessing was a product of my tired mind, or something more sinister. I kept checking the security feed on my phone, and each time I noticed odd movements, a figure lingering near the fuel pumps, another shadow slipping behind the building. The movements were too calculated, too methodical to be random. I began to suspect that someone was using the area's infamous reputation to stage these disturbances, playing on the fears of travelers like me to mask their real activities. The idea was disturbing enough, and I felt my pulse quicken at the thought of being part of someone else's twisted game. At one point, the sounds grew louder, a series of deliberate thuds that echoed across the concrete, as if someone was stomping around just out of sight. I remembered hearing that this rest area was once the scene of violent crimes, and it hit me that the very same tactics might be at work now. Whoever was behind these disturbances was using the past as a smokescreen, exploiting the natural dread of the place to cover up what they were really doing. The more I thought about it, the more I felt a prickle of paranoia. Every noise, every flicker of a light, seemed to be a message, a signal that I was being watched and perhaps even hunted. I considered getting back into my truck and leaving as soon as possible, but something compelled me to stay a little longer. I sat in my rig, eyes glued to the rearview mirror and scanning the dark lot. I tried to steady my breathing, but the feeling of being observed wouldn't let go. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow on the security feed and the sound of those deliberate footsteps. The rest area, with its crumbling infrastructure and eerie silence, suddenly felt like a trap set by someone who knew exactly how to exploit fear. Eventually, the dread became too overwhelming. I decided it was time to leave, but as I started my rig, I noticed a dark sit-in parked at the far end of the lot, almost hidden in the shadows. I couldn't tell if it was there before I arrived, or if it had come later, but the presence of that vehicle sent a shiver down my spine. It was parked at an odd angle, and its windows were tinted so dark that it was impossible to see inside. I couldn't help but feel that the sedan was watching me, or perhaps that I was being watched from it. I tried to ignore it and focused on getting back on the road, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I felt the unsettling sensation of eyes following my every move. As I slowly merged back onto the highway, I kept one eye on the back, watching for any sign that the sedan was tailing me. For several miles, it trailed at a distance that was just close enough to be unnerving. I tried to rationalize it, thinking that maybe it was just another trucker or someone who got lost. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The combination of the staged disturbances at the rest area and the set-in's silent pursuit painted a picture of deliberate, calculated action. Someone was out there, using the darkness and the old legends of that rest area to create an atmosphere of fear, possibly to keep people from noticing what they were really up to. After what felt like an eternity of tension and paranoia, I finally reached a well-lit exit and the sit-in disappeared from my view. I pulled into a familiar busy truck stop to decompress and try to shake off the lingering dread. Even as I sat inside my truck, the images of the rest area haunted me, the flickering lights, the inexplicable movements on the security feed. and that unnerving sense of being watched. I couldn't help but replay every moment in my head, trying to make sense of the deliberate staging and wondering if I had narrowly escaped becoming a victim of something far worse. I'm not one to dwell on ghost stories or urban legends, but that night taught me that sometimes the true horror isn't something supernatural at all. It's the cold, calculated actions of people who use fear as a weapon, exploiting the dark history of a place to cover up their own crimes. I still don't know who was behind those staged disturbances, or what they were really after, but I learned one thing for sure. Some spots on the road have secrets that go far beyond the tales truckers share over coffee breaks. I'm not going back to that rest area anytime soon, and I'll be keeping an extra close watch on my mirrors from now on. I remember that night like it was etched into my brain. I was hauling a load up north when the weather took a turn for the worse. It was one of those harsh winter nights when the cold bites through even the thickest of coats and every breath feels like shards of ice. I'd been on the road for hours, the darkness outside almost palpable as I drove along a stretch of highway that seemed to vanish into nothingness. The radio was a low murmur in the background, and all I could focus on was keeping my rig steady against the relentless wind and swirling snow. But as the miles slipped away, something about the road began to nag at me, a feeling that something was off. At first, it was subtle. I noticed that the highway was covered in a layer of black ice, so smooth and unyielding that it looked almost like a sheet of glass laid over the asphalt. I'd seen ice before, of course, but nothing like this. This was different. There were no telltale cracks or white patches, just an unbroken, dangerous slickness that promised nothing but trouble if I let my guard down. I pressed my foot a little harder on the brake as I approached a bend, my heart starting to race as I realized just how precarious the situation was. Every instinct in my body told me to slow down even further, but the cold had numbed my limbs and made every movement feel sluggish. As I navigated the treacherous patch of ice, I began to notice something even more unsettling. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught fleeting images, shapes that weren't there a second later. At first, I figured it was just the ice playing tricks on me, or maybe a reflection of the bright dashboard lights off some stray snowflake. But the visions persisted, more insistent each time I glanced away from the road. They weren't clear enough to make out any features, just vague forms that slipped away into the darkness. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of the light, or the result of my exhaustion, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that my mind was unraveling under the stress. The temperature in the cab was dropping steadily, and I could feel the cold creeping in through every seam. My hands, wrapped around the wheel, were starting to feel numb, and I had to concentrate hard to keep my grip firm. It wasn't just the ice that was dangerous out there, it was the battle going on inside my head. I'd always prided myself on being tough, on handling long hauls through bad weather without a second thought. But that night, as I fought to keep control of my truck on the slick, unyielding road, I began to feel an overwhelming sense of vulnerability that I'd never experienced before. I couldn't help but wonder if those fleeting visions were nothing more than the side effects of extreme cold and oxygen deprivation, or perhaps even guilt-ridden hallucinations born from a mistake I made years ago. I've been involved in a fender bender in conditions not much like these, a mistake that, while minor at the time, had left a mark on my conscience. Late at night, when the world was quiet, and all I had was my own thoughts, I would replay that incident over and over, haunted by what might have been. Now, as I battled the black ice and my own inner demons, those memories began to blur with the present, forming a haze of regret and fear that made it hard to tell what was real. I was coming up to a sharp curve when the truck started to slide, the slick surface sending it careening in a direction I hadn't intended. The steering wheel felt as though it were made of ice, and every muscle in my body tensed as I fought desperately to correct the course. For a few agonizing seconds, time seemed to slow down. I remember the sound of metal scraping against the concrete barrier, the jolt that nearly knocked the breath out of me, and the sensation of weightlessness as the cab tipped ever so slightly. In that moment, I was suspended between life and death, the icy grip of the highway threatening to swallow me whole. As the truck finally ground to a halt against the guardrail, I sat there in a daze, heart pounding in my ears and hands, still trembling on the wheel. The world outside was eerily silent, the only sound the soft patter of snow against the metal of my rig. But even in that silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by my own guilt, by the relentless forces of nature, and perhaps by something else that lurked in the periphery of my vision. The vague shapes I'd seen earlier seemed to dance just beyond the edge of my sight, as if they were waiting for me to lose focus once more. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, trying to catch my breath and steady my racing thoughts. The cold seeped into my bones, and I could feel it working its way into every part of me, blurring the lines between reality and hallucination. I wondered if I'd slipped into a kind of hypothermic delirium, where every shadow held a hidden meaning and every gust of wind was a whisper of past mistakes. The guilt from that long-ago accident, the one that still haunted my dreams, pressed in on me like a physical weight. I saw the faces of those I'd wronged in the corners of my eyes, fleeting, ghostly apparitions that vanished when I tried to look directly at them. It was a night of raw, unfiltered terror, not the kind that comes from an external monster, but the kind that gnaws at you from the inside, stripping you down to your most vulnerable self. I knew that I had narrowly escaped something fatal, that the black ice had nearly claimed me as its victim. The combination of nature's unforgiving elements and the psychological toll of my own remorse had brought me to the brink. I couldn't tell if the visions were merely symptoms of my body shutting down under the stress of hypothermia, or if they were the manifestation of all the guilt I had carried for years. Either way, they were as real to me as the cold, hard metal of the truck and the icy highway that had nearly ended it all. Eventually, I managed to coax the engine back to life, and slowly began moving again, every inch of progress a battle against the treacherous road and the turmoil inside me. I headed for the nearest service station, a small flickering beacon of warmth in the distance. As I drove, I kept my eyes fixed on the road, trying desperately to ignore the unsettling images that continued to flicker at the edge of my vision. The highway was still coated in that deadly black ice, a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong, and every bump, every shift in the wind sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. When I finally pulled into the service station, I climbed out of the truck and stepped into the biting cold, my breath forming clouds in the air. I leaned against the cab for a moment, letting the shock of the near accident wash over me, and tried to piece together what had happened. There was no one around to share my burden, no comforting words from a colleague, just the endless winter night and the quiet hum of my racing thoughts. I knew that I'd never forget that night, not just for the physical danger, but for the way it had forced me to confront the darkness that lay within me. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but replay that night in my mind. I'd see the slick highway and remember the fear of losing control, and I'd catch glimpses of those ghostly visions that might have been nothing more than my mind's desperate attempt to cope with the overwhelming cold and guilt. I was left with a deep, abiding respect for the unpredictable forces of nature and an even deeper awareness of the fragility of my own mind. That night taught me that sometimes the greatest horror isn't the external threat, but the internal battle that rages quietly beneath the surface. I still drive, and I still haul loads through winter storms, but I never forget the terror of that night. Every time I see a patch of ice glistening on the highway, I remember the way it silently threatened to end everything in an instant. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I think I see a shadow flicker, a reminder that on the coldest nights, when the line between reality and hallucination blurs, the past has a way of coming back to haunt you. I was on my usual route hauling a load up north when everything went sideways. One minute I was cruising down the highway with my favorite country station playing in the background, and the next, a string of unexpected road closures forced me to take a detour I'd never seen before. I couldn't tell if it was just another one of those bureaucratic mix-ups or something more sinister. I was already fighting off the heavy exhaustion of long hours on the road and a gnawing feeling that some personal demons were catching up with me. I figured I'd just follow the signs and get back on track, but what I encountered was nothing like I'd ever experienced. At first, the detour was just a narrow, winding road that veered off the main highway. The signposts were few and far between, and the ones I did see looked oddly old-fashioned, as if they'd been pulled straight out of a bygone era. I switched on my GPS, hoping for some guidance, but it just spun around on the screen like it was lost in its own time warp. My phone had no service, and every so often, I caught a glimpse of mile markers that didn't match anything I remembered from my countless trips through that region. It felt like I'd driven into a place where the normal rules of time and space no longer applied. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a long stretch of rural road I hadn't noticed before, but the silence was unnatural. There was no traffic, no distant hum of passing cars, no headlights winking at me from the horizon. Just the steady thrum of my own engine and the occasional whisper of wind slicing through the barren trees. It felt like I was the last person left in the world. Even the stars overhead seemed too sharp, too cold, like I had slipped into some forgotten corner of existence, where the rest of civilization had simply vanished. I pressed on, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The further I drove, the stranger things got. The landmarks I had come to expect on my usual route, the neon diner that stayed open all night, the dusty gas station with the old Coke machine out front, even the faded billboard advertising a town I never stopped in, were all gone. In their place were empty fields, clusters of gnarled trees that seemed to twist toward the road like reaching fingers, and long stretches of nothing, just blacktop and void. Then I started seeing things. It began as flickers in my periphery, shadowy figures at the edge of the road, gone when I turned my head. A shape in my side mirror that disappeared when I glanced back. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on me, the mind's way of filling in the blanks when it had nothing else to work with. But the longer I drove, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The road itself seemed off. The paint on the dividing lines looked faded and old, cracked like they hadn't been touched up in years. The asphalt felt too smooth, like fresh pavement, yet there were no signs of recent work. And the mile markers, I swear they were decreasing, not increasing, like I was driving backward in time. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. The loneliness of the road settled in my bones, mixing with an anxiety I couldn't shake. I thought about that accident years ago, the one I tried so hard to forget. It had been late at night, not unlike this one, and I'd been just as tired. A momentary lapse in attention, a slick patch of road, a swerve that came half a second too late. The sound of metal crunching, glass shattering, the silence afterward. The past doesn't let go easy, no matter how much distance you put between yourself and your mistakes. And right now it felt like that stretch of road had brought me face to face with something I've been running from for years. Then far worse. But I do know one thing. Next time I see a detour sign on a road, I'll recognize I'm not taking it. Some roads weren't meant to be traveled. Some places weren't meant to be found. And sometimes, if you're not careful, the past has a way of catching up to you. I kept going, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Every so often, I thought I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Just a faint glow in the distance, never getting closer. But when I glanced back again, they'd be gone. I was starting to feel untethered, like I was slipping out of sync with reality. Sleep deprivation does strange things to a man, but this was different. This felt deliberate, like the road itself was shifting around me, leading me somewhere I wasn't meant to go. Then I hit the fork. The road split into two paths, one leading toward what looked like a town, faint streetlights flickering in the distance, and the other swallowed in darkness. I hesitated, my gut screaming at me that neither choice was good. The town didn't feel right. It was too still, like a picture of a place rather than a real one. And the dark road? That was worse. I thought of the choices I'd made in my life, the roads I'd taken and the ones I'd avoided. Sometimes we don't realize we're making a mistake until we're already too far down the wrong path to turn back. I had a feeling that whatever was waiting for me at the end of either road was something I wasn't ready to face. I took the path toward the lights, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The road twisted and turned, but the closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. The town wasn't getting any closer. It was like I was driving in place, the scenery shifting around me but never actually changing. Panic clawed up my throat. I needed to get out of here. I slammed my foot on the gas, my truck roaring forward, the engine fighting against something unseen. The headlights flickered. The dashboard lights blinked, numbers scrambling like a clock losing its grip on time. Then, just when I thought the world itself was about to rip apart, I blinked, and I was back on my usual route. Just like that, the detour was gone. No fork in the road. No vanishing landmarks. Just the highway I knew, stretching ahead like none of it had ever happened. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. I looked at the mirror. Nothing, just my trailer, solid and real. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been somewhere else, that I'd crossed into a place I wasn't supposed to see. I pulled into the first truck stop I saw, my nerves shot to hell. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the lot. I sat there in my rate for a long time, gripping the wheel, grounding myself in the familiar sounds of distant chatter and the hum of idling engines. I didn't bother telling anyone what happened. What could I even say? That I took a wrong turn into nowhere, that I saw things that shouldn't have been there, that a road almost swallowed me whole. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was exhaustion, some psychological trick my mind played on me, or some. I was hauling a load up north on a bitterly cold night when my rig decided to give out on me. Stranded miles from the nearest town, I remembered passing a faded sign for an old abandoned truck depot a few miles back. They say that place was once the scene of a brutal crime and a series of unexplained disappearances. Normally, I'd brush off such stories as roadside lore meant to scare new drivers, but that night, with my engine sputtering and my phone dead, I had no choice but to check it out. Pulling into the lot, I was hit by a mix of relief and unease. The depot was a hulking, decaying structure, its walls pockmarked with rust and neglect, and broken windows staring like empty eye sockets. There was an odd silence hanging over the place, broken only by the occasional groan of metal in the wind. I parked my truck near the entrance, determined to find a phone or even just shelter from the piercing cold. I had heard the rumors, but I never expected to be face to face with a place that seemed to absorb all warmth and hope. I stepped out into the frigid air and made my way toward the main door. The metal door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the depot was a labyrinth of dark, narrow corridors and vast, dusty halls lined with old equipment and discarded crates. I switched on my flashlight and was immediately overwhelmed by the stale odor of decay and neglect. The beam of light bounced off peeling paint and rusted surfaces, revealing scattered remnants of the past. A few yellow newspaper clippings pinned to a wall, faded photographs of what looked like old truck convoys, and scribbled notes that hinted at something far more sinister than simple abandonment. As I wandered deeper into the building, the eerie quiet began to give way to a series of unsettling sounds. I couldn't tell if it was the wind sneaking through broken panes or something more deliberate. Footsteps echoing in the distance, the clatter of loose metal falling somewhere behind me. Every noise made me stop in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears. I felt as if I were intruding on a place that wasn't meant for the living, a forgotten relic with secrets better left undisturbed. While exploring one of the smaller rooms off a narrow hallway, I found evidence that suggested the depot wasn't entirely abandoned. Amidst piles of dusty paperwork and discarded tools, I came across a battered ledger and some documents that detailed shipments of contraband and lists of names. The dates on the files were old, but the handwriting was fresh, as if someone had been updating these records until recently. There were cryptic notes about deliveries and collections, and even a reference to a group that operated outside the law, a network that used this depot as a base for illicit activities. I couldn't tell if these documents were part of some vigilant justice scheme or a smuggling ring using the depot's grim past to cover their tracks, but the realization sent a chill through me. As night deepened, the oppressive atmosphere of the depot only grew more claustrophobic. The once quiet corridors began to hum with an almost imperceptible activity. I heard the sound of soft footsteps and murmured voices that seemed to echo from the far corners of the building. I started noticing signs that someone had been there recently, a fresh layer of dust disturbed by hurried movements, a door that hadn't been properly latched, and even a faint smell of cigarette smoke that didn't belong in a place long abandoned. It became clear that I was not the only one using this depot for shelter on that cold night. My pulse quickened as I retraced my steps, desperate to find my way back to my truck. The layout of the building, which I had assumed was simple, suddenly felt like a maze. Every corridor looked the same, each turn leading me deeper into the heart of the depot. The farther I walked, the more the sounds of activity grew louder and more deliberate. It was as if someone or a group of people was intentionally staging disturbances to keep the depot shrouded in mystery. The isolated, decaying halls began to feel like a trap, each narrow passageway closing in around me with a sense of impending doom. I soon realized that the network operating out of the depot wasn't just a collection of ghost stories from truck stop legends. They were real, and they were watching. I could sense eyes following me in the darkness, and every sound made me jump. The documents I'd found hinted at a system of covered meetings and illicit deals, and it dawned on me that my accidental arrival might have tipped someone off. I began to suspect that my presence was not a mere accident, but a calculated disruption to their carefully orchestrated operations. Every instinct in me screamed that I was out of my depth and that I should leave immediately. Frantically, I retraced my steps, trying to navigate back to a corridor that I recognized. The sound of footsteps behind me grew steadily louder, and I could hear faint voices discussing in low, urgent tones. I kept my flashlight clutched tightly as I pressed forward, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. At one point, I ducked into a small alcove behind a stack of old crates, my heart thundering in my chest. From my hiding spot, I watched as a couple of figures passed by, their outlines barely visible in the dim light. They moved with purpose, checking their surroundings as if they were making sure no one was watching. I realized then that these people were the ones behind the staged disturbances, using the depot's notorious reputation to cover their illicit business. Time seemed to slow down as I waited, my breath shallow and rapid. Every second felt like an eternity as I strained to listen for any sign that they might notice me. Eventually, after what felt like ages, the voices faded and the footsteps receded. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. My only thought was to get back to my truck and drive away from that cursed place as fast as possible. I retraced my path carefully, my flashlight beam darting from shadow to shadow as I navigated the maze-like halls. When I finally emerged back into the open air, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted to my truck and practically threw myself behind the wheel, not daring to look back. The memory of the eerie corridors, the evidence of a hidden network, and the oppressive feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I fired up the engine, and as the truck rumbled to life, I stole a final glance at the depot. The building loomed in the distance, its broken windows and darkened halls a silent testament to the secrets it held. I drove away as quickly as I could, the image of that forsaken depot etched into my mind. I never did find out who was behind the network or what exactly they were up to, but I knew one thing for sure. That place was no legend. It was a living nightmare of crime and cover-ups, thriving in the shadows of an abandoned depot. Every time I pass a deserted lot or hear a rumor about an old, forgotten building with a dark past, I can't help but shudder. That night taught me that sometimes the real horror isn't in ghosts or supernatural forces, but in the cold, calculated actions of people hiding in plain sight. I keep on trucking, but I make it a point to steer clear of places that carry more than just a bad reputation. The depot remains a stark reminder that even in the most isolated corners of our world, there are secrets too dangerous to be uncovered. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the video on screen.